Welcome to Name Takes, a podcast about the cultures of naming, from the names of streets to buildings to people and beyond. What are the stories behind certain names? And what causes do specific names promote? Where can the roots of one name or other be found? Could these be invented? In Name Takes, we include artists' voices and cases from the art field. Because in art, meaning-making is central. And most of all, because art helps us formulate better questions about the present. In this episode, we're focusing on name-giving. And we're starting from our own home, Kunstinstituut Melly, in the heart of Rotterdam.
Hi, I'm your host, KM. Excited to be here and that we're connected. I'm speaking to you from Kunstinstituut Melly, an art institution in Rotterdam. Welcome. You may know that until 2020, Kunstinstituut Melly had a different name. It was called Witte de Wit Center for Contemporary Art. What was behind this previous name? Who coined it and why? Well, in 1989, our institution's founders chose to call the art center after the street it was located on, the Witte de Witstraat in the center of Rotterdam. At the time, city administrators and cultural workers wanted to transform the Witte de Witstraat into an arts corridor in Rotterdam. So naming the center after the street was part of a bigger cultural agenda. And to a large extent, this urban ambition has been accomplished. Today, our street is lined with cafes, hotels, shops, and of course, art centers. The city's main museums bookend the street. You have the Maritime Museum to the east, and the Boijmans Museum, the Nieuwe Instituut, and the Kunsthal in the Museum Park on the west end. Our Kunstinstituut is located in between these iconic institutions. But who was Witte de Wit? And why might this main street in the city center be named after this person? Witte Cornelissen de Wit was born in a hamlet in South Holland in 1599. His body is buried in the St. Lawrence Church in Rotterdam, only a 15-minute walk from us. During his lifetime, Witte Cornelissen de Wit worked as a sea merchant and became a naval officer in the VOC and the GWC. The VOC stands for the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie and is known in English as the Dutch East Indies Company. It was founded in 1602. Some years later, the GWC, or the West Indies Company, was established. Its fleets traveled transatlantically. The VOC and its western sister were shareholder-based companies in the business of exploration and trade, sanctioned by royal decree and government. They became the first global trading ventures, and to this day, they're hailed by many for their contributions to geographical knowledge, for their business approach, and for laying the ground for contemporary global giant enterprises. But what cannot be forgotten is that these companies were in fact instruments of colonization. Their business involved eradicating indigenous societies, in particular through the VOC settlements in Asia and Africa, and the West Indies Company settlements throughout the Americas. Both companies made use of and made profit from enslaved people. Throughout the Netherlands, several streets are named after naval officers and governors of these settlements, as well as by well-known figures of the 17th century. As a matter of fact, Rotterdam is not the only city with a Witte de Witstraat. There are over 50 towns and cities in the Netherlands with a Witte de Witstraat, and together they are almost 15 kilometers long. Historian Rob Coloos dedicated his master's thesis at Rotterdam's Erasmus University to street naming in North and South Holland. He explains that in the 19th century, many Dutch cities underwent rapid growth, which also prompted the drive to formalize street naming. It was in a way a time of quote-unquote streamlining municipal and state bureaucracy. The national postal stamp was introduced in the 1850s and is a good example of this unified and logistical approach to the city and nation as a system. Simultaneous to the Industrial Revolution and the urban modernization that came with it, the Dutch state also promoted the creation of a collective heritage. This moment was the birth of a so-called Gouden Eeuw, the golden 17th century. That's right. The notion of a golden age is primarily an invention of the 19th century patriotism in the Netherlands. Dutch banknotes depicted historical figures and events related to the 17th century maritime empire and nobility. Public buildings were designed in a so-called national style. The reemergence of Delft blue ceramics was also a part of this nationalistic agenda. But what's important for us here is that all of these components, from ceramics to bills and coins moving through people's hands to public sculptures passed on a daily basis, created a collective imagined community, promoting cohesion and nationalistic belonging. And what about the names of streets, parks, or squares? Together, they form city texts that also have the power to forge an imagined community. According to Coloos, the historian who I just mentioned, streets named or renamed during the 19th century made increasing reference to local and national history. Knowing this, I wonder what kind of belonging we're actually talking about. Do we belong to the kind of belonging our street names dictate? Our Witte de Witstraat was named in 1871 and is a clear example of official Dutch history at work. But before that time, many streets in Rotterdam had more practical or descriptive reasons, like most of the streets in our immediate vicinity. Let's check out our immediate neighboring streets.
Ik loop nu dus op de Witte de Witstraat. En ik loop voorbij de Boomgaardstraat richting Zwarte Paardenstraat. En straks kom ik bij de Kromme Elleboog. En ik zie de Schiedamse Vest nu ook al voor me.
The Eendagstraat translates as the Unity Street, by which they mean national unity. The Boomgaardweg is Orchard Road, probably because there used to be an orchard before. The Zwarte Paardenstraat, the Black Horses Street, suggests that there used to be horse stables next to the orchards. The Schiedamse Vest is named after its orientation towards the nearby town of Schiedam. Dominant heritage discourses, like the idea of the Dutch Golden Age, developed hand in hand with liberal modernity. From the 19th century onward, ideas of progress legitimized colonial and imperial expansions. As part of this process, ideas of race, ethnicity, and culture also developed. Since then, the dominant belief has been that Western culture, and therefore the white race, exemplifies the highest cultural achievements. And this idea has become deeply embedded in the social psyche. But it is no secret that this worldview has been challenged by new historical analysis, anti-racism, and cultural diversity. These more accurate and multivocal trajectories frame contact, progress, and conflict in different terms. Struggles for representation are at the heart of this social project. As part of these movements, non-dominant stories are remembered and voiced. New perspectives emerge, as do new conflicts. Given the gaps, forceful omissions, and wrongful glorifications, how can we think about heritage now? What should be safeguarded for posterity? These questions are inevitably uncomfortable and need to be asked again and again. But more specifically, in our case, when does a name become an obstacle? To close this episode, I'm sharing a fictional story called The Headless Trees, which is part of a film currently in development by Iranian-born Rotterdam-based artist Sara Rejay.
The town was built about 2 decades prior to the war to accommodate the refinery workers and the university tutors. The main plan consisted of 2 broad avenues, intersecting in the heart of town, branching to the main streets and the boulevards, then to the side streets and the dead-ended alleys. All the streets were named after poets. The main intersecting avenues were named after the most influential poets, and so on. The more important the street, the more famous the poet. The taxis, the buses, and the pedestrians made their routes from one poet to another. The residents made riddles and games for the tourist, reciting poetry instead of giving addresses. Poets appeared on envelopes, on invoices, in booklets, on bags, and on shop windows. By the start of the war, large groups of refugees arrived, seeking shelter in town. In City of Poets, new neighborhoods were quickly built and added to the existing plan. When the city council ran out of the poets' names, the literary scholars were called in to search for the unknown and the forgotten poets. And so, the last poets' names were found and added to the city map. But the war lasted for 8 years, day by day bringing more people to the town. Once the council ran out of all the poets' names, the names of the writers were added to the map. At least they belonged to the literary world. After the writers, they selected the names of the national heroes, the kings, and then the scientists. After the scientists came the mountains, and after the mountains came the flowers and the trees. Quickly the poets who were once the majority became a minority, lost between the masses of new streets, between flowers and trees, heroes, writers, and athletes. No one thought about poetry anymore. By the end of the war, the city council changed all the street names to the names of the war martyrs, young soldiers, once the inhabitants of City of Poets themselves. Soon the citizens found themselves lost in between the memories of the forgotten poets, between flowers and trees, heroes, cities, athletes, and the martyrs of war. Mom's house was at the end of an alley named after a 12th century poet, famous for his romantic epics. In the small garden, Mom had planted a white mulberry tree and built a small marble pond and coated it in pool blue.
About this story, its author, Sarah Rajet, says,
I wrote a story of City of Poets inspired by a small town which I spent part of my childhood in. It is actually an existing city, but my story is completely fictional. It is just an inspiration. And it's because it was a very small setting, and what I remember from my childhood was all these poets' names.
For Sarah, the disappearance of street naming systems represents more than shifts in urban ideology. It also stands for her own experience of emigration, from the Iranian south to Tehran, and eventually to Rotterdam.
To me, actually, that really represents everything that I experienced. And I still do, because now living in the Netherlands for almost 20 years, every time I go back to visit my family, I'm completely lost.
In our next episode, we'll talk about name choosing and name changing. But perhaps in the meanwhile, you may want to take a walk in your own neighborhood and look around with another set of eyes. Do you feel like you belong to the community your street name imagines? What or who disappeared from your street net? And who was never included? And that's where we'll leave it for now. Join us for our next episode of Name Takes, a podcast about culture and naming. Thank you for listening. Yours, KM.
Name Takes is produced by Kunstinstituut Melly in Rotterdam, thanks to a grant from a donor who wishes to remain unnamed. Research and writing for this podcast by Sarah de Meuse and Sofia Hernandez Chonkoy. Special thanks to artist Sarah Rajet for participating in this episode. Sarah's The City of Poets is narrated by Monica Block, and the film is produced by Manon Bovenkerk from Nearby Film. Our gratitude goes to Akene Wilson for performing KM and to Judith Scholz for performing Select Citations. Voice recording, mixing and original music created by Jan Poel at Okapi Recordings in Rotterdam. Mastered by Master Renzo Mastering. Production management was overseen by Wendy van Slagmaat Bos and communication and marketing by Jeroen Laven. Kunstinstituut Melly is supported by the Ministry of Education and Culture in the Netherlands and the City of Rotterdam. Additional funding is procured through admission tickets, sales of publications, foundation grants, and individual donations. For more information, please visit kunstinstituutmelly.nl.